Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Welcome this morning to this seminar, and welcome to the online audience as well. Thank you for joining us. Evan and I are delighted to be hosting Aaron Sexton. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us. Aaron is coming from Cornell University. He just started a new faculty position in the School of Integrative Plant Studies. And previously, he had 2 postdoc positions in Europe, most recently in Munich at the Technical University of Munich, and then previously in Paris at the Foundation for Research in Biodiversity. Did I get that right? Yeah. Great. And so Aaron is a plant ecologist. He's doing super cool work in urban systems, which I'm excited about. He's been studying spontaneous urban plant and animal communities in urban community gardens and other natural areas, as well as plant-pollinator interactions in cities and the metacommunity dynamics. So we're pleased to have him here. He's also recently been looking at some of the recent fires in New York City and the impacts of those fires. So I'm excited to hear more about that. And Aaron's talk today is Time to Abandon the Urban Biotic Homogenization Hypothesis. Thank you. Please welcome me in joining Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to be here and talk a little bit about some of my work and some of my ideas. And part of that reason that I'm excited to be here is because CARI is a really important institute when it comes to urban ecology. And to get started, I'll kind of give a brief history of urban ecology. I think it's a really exciting field because it is in part a very young field, right? It first got started, actually one of the birthplaces was here at CARI. There was a lot of really interesting research on urbanization gradients in New York City. But actually around the same time, there was a second birthplace of urban ecology, which was over in Berlin. And during the Cold War, a lot of the scientists there in East Berlin were stuck in East Berlin. And before that, the idea of ecology was you go down to the tropics and you study rich, pristine biodiversity. But these researchers were now stuck in Berlin, so let's do some urban ecology in Berlin, right? And so we have these 2 schools that are getting developed at the time. Since then, we've had the Berlin School of Urban Ecology grow out of that, and a lot of other really great research institutes like the LTRs we have over here in the United States, but a lot of really interesting research that has developed over a pretty quick time in this young field. And the field is also highly interdisciplinary. Right? We have a lot of overlapping fields that we work with, whether it be landscape architecture, urban planning, sociology, right? It's a very interdisciplinary field. And within that, there's a lot of different ideas and hypotheses that kind of form the way that we think about our urban ecosystems. And today, I'm really just going to focus in on one of those hypotheses, and that is this urban biotic homogenization hypothesis. And it is one that I think plays a pretty big role in how we think about our urban ecosystems, and was first proposed around 20 years ago. From this quite good paper, states that urbanization as a major cause of biotic homogenization. And within this, there's basically 2 central arguments. The first one is basically within city. So this is, as we increase with urbanization, we increase our biotic homogenization. More and more urban leads to more and more of the same communities repeating over and over again. The second hypothesis is basically across cities. So across independent, separate cities, we should expect to see the same ecological communities over and over again. And of course, this is a concern for many reasons, one of which is biodiversity, right? Even if in our urban areas we add certain like flowers or food resources and have higher alpha diversity, if we don't have any turnover or differentiation, no beta diversity, then our overall biodiversity in our cities is going to be quite low, much lower than, say, a natural area, right? And this hypothesis was first proposed in 2006, like I said, and it has played a pretty big role in urban ecology. Just a couple of years ago, there was a really nice synthesis done of this specific hypothesis. And they found that the growth of testing this hypothesis has grown almost logarithmically over the years. Really kicked off after that 2006 paper, and now more and more studies are testing it, so much so that we've seen it tested over 200 times in the last 20 years. Now, very importantly, in this synthesis paper, they found that it was only supported about 55% of the time. So in only half of the cases did we see any support for this foundational hypothesis, right? And actually, in many cases, we often found opposing trends, such that homogeneity was decreasing with urbanization, right? Just take one example here in New York City, where they looked at the woody plant communities, and they found that beta diversity was actually highest in the urban and urban core areas. And this was not just invasive species, this was among our native species as well. So we're actually seeing an increase in beta diversity or heterogeneity with urbanization in many instances. And so I am here to argue today, or I guess make the statement, that I think that this hypothesis has been overstated, both in its magnitude and its scope, and it is playing too large of a role in the field of urban ecology. And I will make that argument from a few different angles. One, looking at metacommunity dynamics, and really focusing in on what our communities look like within one city. And then another one will talk about urban typology and urban form across multiple different cities. And then another important point about your comparison and how that's going to influence the results that you get. And then, of course, we need to include caveats, or at least the peer reviewers of this paper think that we need to include caveats of where we might be wrong or where we should expect to see homogenization. And then looking forward, how we can use this to address future research questions and adapt the field. So getting started right away, thinking about metacommunity dynamics, right? I would argue that there are three facets or components that are exemplified in almost every single urban ecosystem that very heavily influence the metacommunity dynamics in our cities. The first one is strong fragmentation. So we know from road ecology and human infrastructure can have really, really strong fragmentation effects and can separate our habitat patches. Another one is high degrees of habitat heterogeneity. Because of the way that we manage our green spaces, as they're called in cities, we have high degrees of heterogeneity between our habitat patches in our cities. And then last is disturbance. Disturbance is extremely common in our urban areas, and it can influentially change these communities and reshape them over time as well. And these are all going to introduce heterogeneity into our metacommunity, right? If we think about the first one, fragmentation. This one's really important because it maintains separation between our habitat patches. This fragmentation ensures that there are not constant colonization and spread between all of our patches within our cities, right? So if we can think about an example, we have pictured here the Bronx in the United States, in New York, one of the fantastic areas to study urban ecology. And if we look at it, we see a lot of green. A lot of gray, right? But we do also see a bit of green mixed in there as well. So there are a lot of habitat patches, some larger than others, some isolated more so than others. But we do have these patches that are generally fragmented. We do have some connecting pathways like the Bronx River as a blue way and some other green ways, but the metacommunity does have these fragmented patches, right? And this fragmentation role can play a really important, fragmentation can play a really important role in our communities. Just as an example, we'll take a look at this great paper that was done recently on mice populations in New York. And they looked at the genetic differences between populations in the city. And they have this great quote where they say that genetic differences between populations separated by just a few kilometers are more significant than differences between prehistorically isolated land masses. So in very small spatial scales, we can have very, very strong fragmentation and separation as a result of urbanization. And this is among what I would call an urban adapter, right? Mice love urban areas. They love our food, they love the resources and the nesting that we provide. So it's not as if I am cherry picking a species that is especially fragmented by urbanization. These are mice, they do well, and we're still seeing this really, really strong fragmentation separation effect here. So we document this strong fragmentation force, I would argue, is pretty well known in urban areas, in our metacommunities, but additionally, we have this high degree of heterogeneity, right? The environment is very different across our urban ecosystems, both in terms of environmental gradients and physical gradients, as well as categorical habitat type differences. And these are both important, right? Environmental gradients are very important for biodiversity. In urban areas, we've studied these extensively, things like the urban heat island, which can influence community composition, phenology, the timing of events. But we also have things such as the luxury effect, where wealthier neighborhoods tend to have higher alpha biodiversity or different community compositions, right? And these gradients are especially important because they've been shown to introduce greater heterogeneity in our populations. So an example from another urban adapter, ragweed here, they studied urban populations and rural populations and found greater heterogeneity among the urban populations in terms of fitness and phenology than they did among the rurals. And these environmental gradients introduce high degrees of nestedness. There's quite a bit of research to show that in our urban areas, we have extremely high degrees of nestedness. And that's very important when we think about beta diversity, because if we come back to our basic formula here, beta diversity basically has two components, right? We have turnover and nestedness. And if our urban areas are exhibiting very high degrees of nestedness, we have one component to beta diversity and change across our communities. The other component, turnover, is maintained via differentiation in our habitat types. These different habitat types that we have in our cities support very different community compositions. So for example, if you're looking at gardens or parks, streetscapes, vacant lots, these communities have entirely different environmental conditions and support entirely different community compositions, right? So we can imagine this kind of diversity of habitat patches that we have in our cities that can differ in their communities, whether it be vacant lots or cemeteries or community gardens or green roofs. These all have very, very different ecological communities that still exist in close proximity to one another in our cities, right? And you'll notice I set these up as kind of a grid, and this grid is our management goals and intensity in our urban ecosystems. So you can imagine that we have goals of management, whether that be high degrees of cultivation, and that might be production or beauty or some sort of purpose that we intrinsically love. And that might be things like parks, botanical gardens, farms, golf courses, right? These are highly managed landscapes. But we can also have highly managed landscapes that are managed for their biodiversity or their wildness, right? New York City, for example, has some really nice remnant forests. And these areas are managed intensively. We do a lot of invasive species removal, we do a lot of planting, a lot of control. And so there is a high degree of management for wildness. At the same time, we can have these wild spaces that are not at all or very little managed, right? And so those communities are going to support entirely different community compositions, And this is something that one of my mentors has written a lot about how the different levels of human investment are going to support different communities of spontaneous, maintained, facilitated, cultivated biodiversity, right? And that can differ whether your site is abandoned or remnant, restored, designed, and all of these types of management styles are going to support very different ecological communities. So we have these different habitat types. I'll just show an example of one paper that we're working on where we are looking at urban bee communities across the globe. And we've collected bee communities from over 1,000 different sites. And what we find is that the bee communities in these different habitat types are drastically different from one another. So for example, the bee communities in our community gardens, urban farms, green roofs, tend to be much larger than our species that are in natural areas or large parks. And here I'm just showing you bee size, but we have all sorts of other traits that show that these communities do differ by habitat type across our cities. Another area that I think is really interesting is thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, these vacant lots or street-side vegetation. And there's some really interesting recent research to show that these areas can be rich in biodiversity, even though we're not hovering over them, hugging them to death, as I say, right? One of my favorite examples of this is a paper from Kevin Vega down over in Zurich. And he looked at plant communities in large urban parks, medium-sized green spaces, and then small, or what I would even call like micro parks, these kind of cracks in the sidewalk, right, where we have green space or vegetation popping up. And he found that while these little small micro make up a tiny percentage of our overall green space, they contribute just as much, if not more, to overall beta and alpha diversity, right? So these overlooked areas can often be very, very important for biodiversity and introduce an entirely different kind of community composition into our cities. So we have this patch heterogeneity within our cities, but of course we also have this last component that I talked about, disturbances, right? And these disturbances are important because they ensure that there is new colonization of a community and turnover across time, so that we are ensuring heterogeneity at a temporal scale. And we can think about that at a very small temporal scale, right? Like a lot of research has shown that mowing regimes and mowing frequency can totally change the types of plant and pollinator communities you have in your parks or residential lots. We can also think at more medium-sized temporal scales, whether it be like habitat restorations, where we can see converting turfgrass areas into meadowscapes can change the pollinator communities, and that those changes persist over time. It is not a flash in the pan. Those communities stay year after year after year. And then we can also think at much, much larger scales, right? Urban areas are not immune to natural disasters. We see these effects in our cities as well. You can imagine in New York, Hurricane Sandy, right, came, caused major flooding events, totally changed the green spaces in our cities. But I would argue even more importantly, it's changed the way that we think about and manage our green spaces, right? Ever since this hurricane came in, the city kind of woke up and realized that they had this storm surge issue and has kind of redesigned Manhattan to build what they call the Big U, of a lot of different new green spaces along the waterway that are composed of entirely different plant communities or have different topological structures, to ensure that that flooding can be minimized, at least in future flood situations. And so these disasters can not only change the community at that pinpoint, but it also changes the way that we think about our green spaces and can introduce very much different successional pathways in our cities. So if we can imagine, just close our eyes and imagine a hypothetical meta-community, right? And this meta-community has strong fragmentation. It has high degrees of habitat heterogeneity, and there are influential disturbances. You would say that this meta-community likely has high degrees of heterogeneity. There is high degrees of beta diversity. And just because that is in a city does not mean it is all of a sudden homogenous, right? So I would argue that these three components that are almost always in our urban ecosystems lead to high degrees of heterogeneity in our urban meta-communities. So this argument was made within the city, and I think within 15 minutes I've of course completely convinced you that within a city we have heterogeneity, right? But now we also need to think about across cities, right? Because there are basically those two central predictions from the UBH hypothesis. And so now we need to think about homogenization across our cities. And of course, again, we'll start off with meta-community structure, right? We'll think about the Bronx here as we used as our example. But we can imagine another very large, temperate US city like San Francisco. And this meta-community is quite different from the Bronx meta-community, right? We have different spatial design of green spaces, sizes, fragmentation degrees. And this is even much more different, I would argue, than most of our conventional US cities, right? Now here we have pictured at the same spatial scale is Louisville, Kentucky, where Evan and I did our PhD. And sure, we have these green spaces I point out, but a big difference here is that there is a lot of green space kind of interspersed throughout the fabric of the city. In some of these cities, we tend to have much higher tree canopies, and so that allows a little bit more of a hop, skip, and a jump between our patches, right? And this big difference is what we call the difference between land sparing and land sharing. A lot of our megacities practice this effect of land sparing, where we set aside large independent tracts of green spaces, we manicure them, and then we densify around that. And a lot of other cities in the US tend to practice more land sharing, where the green space is interspersed throughout the urban fabric and has a much different, therefore, meta-community structure, right? But this land sparing practice, of course, when we think about this densify effect, is quite common in a lot of our megacities globally. So, of course, in New York, we have Central Park as a prime example of this, right? But in London, we also have Hyde Park, same sort of idea. In Tokyo, they have a massive botanical garden right in the city center, right? So this is kind of a recurring meta-community that we can think of that is very different from the meta-community of our post-industrial cities, for example, right? A city like Detroit or Liverpool is going to exhibit an entirely different meta-community than our land-sparing cities. We have a lot of these more vacant lots, which, again, research has shown can be really, really interesting communities and entirely different from our large, cultivated green spaces. And these post-industrial cities, again, will be different from, say, a medieval city that tends to have really narrow streets, a lot of shade, and therefore totally different plant fungal communities that can live inside of our cities. Yeah? These are also going to be different from our 21st century growth cities. I will be honest, these cities do scare me a little bit. We have, as an example here, this article from the New York Times. They say, America the Bland. And they show you street corners in Nashville, Seattle, or Denver and ask you to choose. And surprise, surprise, you cannot choose because they do have this very distinct typology that is different from our older cities, right? And this 21st century growth in the United States is very different from 21st century growth in China. They're densifying in completely different ways. They have totally different green design management practices and relationships to biodiversity, which is therefore going to create different meta-communities, different levels of alpha, beta diversity across these cities, right? Another example that I've just added is I just moved to Ithaca, New York. It's a bunch of hippies up there, and they love their native lawns, right? Their pocket prairies are everywhere. I think it's incredible, and I think that if you came in and tried to implement a turfgrass lawn, you would get laughed out of the neighborhood, right? And so I think that there is some sort of sociological factor there to be studied as well. But again, a neighborhood or a city with this turfgrass dominance is going to support entirely different plant pollinator, insect communities than we see in a neighborhood or a city that supports and promotes native lawns and pocket prairies, right? So I could go on and on about these typologies, but if we think about the process, we have this gamma diversity, right? This variable regional species pool. And I would argue it is filtered in very unique ways depending on the urban typology. So whether it be human density, green space design, our history, our socio-economies, these unique urban forms harbor unique habitat types, processes, and therefore distinct ecological communities. So we can have different communities within our site, but also different degrees of fragmentation, connectivity, and therefore differences in beta diversity, alpha diversity, biodiversity partitioning, and creating this differentiation between our cities. So if we want to think about this as a nice example, you say, where's the evidence, right? We're going to take a look at a case study of some work that I did in Munich before this, where I was working in Monica Edgerer's lab, a fantastic lab, very, very fun people, where we were looking at community gardens in Berlin and Munich that were surveyed for plant communities over the past 4 years. So a really nice data set where we were looking at these plant communities in just random 1 by 1 meter subplots. You can see sometimes very spontaneous plants, sometimes very cultivated, sometimes very urban, right? And within these surveys, we categorized every individual as a cultivated individual or spontaneous, naturally occurring, right? And that was up to the surveyor's discretion at the time. We then synthesized these data to calculate beta diversity at both the survey level, the garden level, calculated urbanization, and we looked at the community compositions as well. And we did this across the full community, the wild, and the cultivated individuals, right? So we split that out. And if we think about our UBH predictions, the first UBH hypothesis would predict something like this, where as we increase with urbanization, beta diversity should decrease. Now, whether that's linear or there's some sort of tipping point, it doesn't really matter. We should see a drop-off, right? And if we look at our results, we do not find that. So looking at both garden and survey level, there is no relationship between beta diversity and urbanization. And importantly, I want to point out we go from 9% urban to 95% urban. So we cover the entire gradient here, and we do not see any sort of negative relationship in beta diversity with urbanization. If we split this out by species type, what we see is that actually the wild species at the garden level are increasing in beta diversity with urbanization, such that our urban gardens are actually the ones that are most heterogeneous from each other, and therefore we're actually seeing highest degrees of beta diversity in the city among our wild or spontaneous species. Among cultivated species, no such relationship. We don't see any relationship there as we saw in the full. Now, question 2, across city homogenization. Here we're going to take a look at the community composition. So we have an NMDS here. Berlin is in blue, Munich is in red. The darker colors are the more urban sites, and rural is in lighter. And what we see is that there's a little bit of overlap between these cities for sure, but they are statistically unique compositions. Our two cities are independent of one another. And very importantly for the UBH hypothesis, in both cities, the urban gardens are much more similar to the rural gardens than they are to the urban of the other city. This is in direct opposition to the UBH hypothesis, right? Now, this is the full community. If we split this out by wild and cultivated, what we see is a divergence here, where the wild are still diverging between our two cities. They're different, but among cultivated, it's all the same. So when we're purposefully planting and manicuring the space, we are putting the same things in Berlin as we are in Munich. And here is where we do see support for this UBH hypothesis, right? So this was some work that we just published earlier this year. I want to say around the same time, we did a similar analysis with pollinators and found the exact same phenomenon. No negative relationship with urbanization and a divergence in community composition in our pollinators. So this may be an effective habitat type, community gardens, maybe they're unique, but we do see this strong divergence. And one of the reasons I want to point that out is I think that these two cities have very different typologies, right? Berlin has this unique history of East Berlin, West Berlin, that communist capitalist divide, and they have a very different culture than Munich. Munich is known as kind of the wealthy city. It's very manicured, it's very pretty, but they love their neat lines, they love their rules, and they have very nice manicured parks, right? English Garden, I think, is one of the best urban parks in the world. Berlin is also very nice, but I would use the word maybe cool to describe it, not pretty, right? They have a different relationship with nature, and they have a much more wide acceptance of ruderal habitats and vacant lots in the city. Among most of the population, there is a wide understanding and acceptance of these more natural wild spaces in the city than we see in Munich. And some great research has shown that in these kind of ruderal habitat patches, or what they call novel in this paper, they're supporting hundreds of populations of rare and endangered plant species, actually. So again, showing the value of these novel or ruderal habitat patches that we have a rich diversity of in Berlin, but not so much of in Munich, right? So if we come back to our data, we can imagine basically two centroids of our cities, right? And it might look something like this, right? But we can also imagine zooming out and thinking at a more global scale, looking something like this, right? Where Berlin and Munich are within themselves separate typologies, but there are other cities out there that follow that same typology and group together. And so my prediction is that we have these different urban typologies that do have somewhat similar community compositions, but that does not mean that all urban communities are the same thing over and over and over again, right? And I would argue this can somewhat explain why we have a 50% support rate for this hypothesis. If you're working in cities of the same typology, you're going to observe homogenization. But if you're looking across two different typologies like we were here, you're going to observe differentiation, right? So this typology role and influence, I think, is extremely important and has not really been looked into enough in our area, right? There's been other work in transit research where they look at ridership and bike share and walkability, car, traffic stuff, and they find that there are typologies of city form in that way, right? Where we look at the infrastructure of our cities and we do find global typologies. And so our lab next, moving forward, is going to try and do this with biodiversity and see if we can maybe identify urban typologies that would predict contemporary biodiversity. What are the factors or characteristics of our cities that are going to influence whether it be taxonomic, functional diversity, or certain taxa or taxa type, whether it be street trees or forest trees? There's a lot of research to be done here, and I think it's extremely important that we understand the role that urban form and typology plays in this relationship to heterogeneity and homogeneity. Right? So that gets at within and across cities. But one important point I just wanted to also add is thinking about the comparison that we're making, right? So in the field of urban ecology, we love gradients. An urbanization gradient is our favorite thing in the world. So often we set up a study system so that it is maybe 10 to 30 sites going from highly urban to very low urban urbanization gradient, right? There's nothing wrong with this. These are my studies. This is what I do too, right? But the question I think it's very important to think about is, what are we transitioning to? It's an urbanization gradient, high urban to low urban. What is that change? What is our comparison that we should be thinking about, right? And so this hypothesis states that, urban areas are more homogeneous. But is it then what? Is it then natural areas? Is it then a specific type of natural areas like wetlands? Or is it agricultural areas, right? And in the US and Europe, that transition is almost always agriculture, right? Agriculture covers 5 times more land than urban areas. So I don't think that we should pretend that all non-urban land is natural land, right? And in both the US and Europe, a lot of times that agricultural land is highly homogeneous. The average farm size in the United States is 2 square kilometers, and many times that is 1 to 2, maybe 3 crop species that we're growing, right? And so if anyone has driven through Kansas, like I used to have to a lot, it's a lot of corn, right? This picture is at the exact same spatial scale as my metacommunity pictures of our cities, right? This is a much more homogeneous landscape than our urban landscapes. And so when I hear that urbanization is a major cause of homogenization, I think, really? Where we have these agricultural lands that take up 5 times as much space and are much more homogeneous than our urban areas, I don't think that this statement is quite fair as a major cause of homogenization, right? So this agricultural area is dominant and is an important comparison that we need to make. But, okay, let's say that your comparison is a natural area, right? I still think that it's very important that we think about what our comparison is. One of my big arguments is that urban ecosystems are an ecosystem type, so they should be compared to another ecosystem type. You should compare an entire city to, say, an entire coniferous forest of equal size, or another tallgrass prairie of equal size, right? These are apt comparisons. What I would argue is an inappropriate comparison would be to look at urban parks versus all types of national parks, which was the original comparison drawn. And I have 2 problems with that. One is that urban parks, as we talked about earlier, are not representative of the entire urban ecosystem, right? So this would be like if you just looked at lawns and residential lots, then I would argue your comparison should be something like rocky outcrops within a deciduous forest, right? You're not including the entire ecosystem, you're looking at just one habitat type within our ecosystems. And then additionally, I would argue that it is somewhat unfair to compare one ecosystem type against all other ecosystem types. So to compare urban against grassland national parks, forested national parks, wetland national parks, all of these is not necessarily a fair comparison, right? And just because we are beginning to identify the taxa, the traits, the functional groups that we consistently see in our cities does not make them inherently homogeneous or more homogeneous than another ecosystem type, right? There's this great study that was recently, or a large synthesis that was done, where they found basically different functional groups or types of species that do well in our cities. And they gave them nice names like central place foragers or mobile generalists, whatever it may be. But these are the characteristics of species that we tend to see in our cities, right? And just because we're beginning to identify these patterns, I would argue that does not make them homogenous, right? So, the classic pushback I always get is pigeons. I see them everywhere. I see them all the time. Whenever I go to a city, I see pigeons. But if you go to a tall grass prairie, you're going to see big bluestem. If you go to a forest stand and it's a lot of beech, are you calling that forest inherently more homogeneous or at risk of spreading homogeneity? I don't think that that is a fair comparison. So I would argue that we're beginning to identify the patterns and the types of species that exist in our urban ecosystems, and they should be treated as an ecosystem type and compared against other ecosystem types, not all ecosystems in the globe. So there's the bulk of my argument. Now, of course, the important aspect of caveats and where I'm wrong, right? But with this, I just want to say, I would argue that the pendulum is currently all the way over here, where we assume that urban areas are highly homogeneous. They are a problem spreading homogeneity. I've spent today pushing the pendulum all the way on the other side. I'm arguing that actually urban areas are even more heterogeneous than our natural areas, or certainly agricultural, right? But of course, I'm willing to concede the reality may be somewhere in the middle here, where the synthesis suggests it is as well, right? And so with that, there are some important caveats or areas where I will identify homogeneity arising. But this pendulum swinging is really important, because if we read literature from before 2006, we read papers from like the 90s, early 2000s, there's a wide understanding of the role of heterogeneity in our urban ecosystems. These papers will say, the variety of habitat types leads to high beta diversity in our cities. Or other cities, they will say the Scandinavian cities are very different from Mediterranean cities in their architecture, species composition, history, etc. So we had this really diversified, I would argue very exciting approach to urban ecology that accepted this heterogeneity. And since the 2006 paper, we have just assumed that they are homogeneous, and I would argue that is hindering the field. But getting back to the pendulum, right? Three main caveats I want to make are large dispersal taxa, invasives, and modern urban planning, right? And with dispersal, I think there's two different things that we need to think about. And the first one is species that are not heavily fragmented by urbanization. Birds are a classic example of this. They are not really heavily fragmented by roads, for example, and this is where I think some of the most convincing literature is for the UBH hypothesis, is in these bird homogenizations. They are able to colonize all of our patches, and so I can concede that that absolutely can happen in our urban areas where these birds can just dominate or colonize all these spaces. Now, these birds, not so fragmented. At the other end of the spectrum, we have species that are fragmented too much. So taxa that require very, very large habitat ranges. So this is an example we can see very commonly. We tend to lose mega predators and shift to a more mesopredator-dominated community in our urban areas. So we shift from, say, mountain lions and wolves into foxes and coyotes instead. So this dispersal plays a very important role, whether you need a large range and therefore are filtered out, or you're not fragmented at all and can colonize all of our spaces. Another one is invasive species, whether they be rudderals, like the tree of heaven that can kind of colonize anywhere, or hypercompetitors, like the honeybee that can kick out a lot of our native species, right? And this was just a paper that we was co-authored on earlier this year, where we talk about how in urban areas, honeybees show this strong dominance pattern and can absolutely have this homogenizing effect. And so it's quite dangerous to have these, say, honeybee hives in our cities for this homogenization force. Now, another invasive I want to touch on is English ivy, which I don't think gets enough credit, but is a really important invasive species in a lot of our urban forests in North America. And just last year, my collaborator Kane and I were writing this paper about species composition and restoration in our urban areas and how that can be really, really difficult because we have a lot of invasive species pressure in our cities. And once those invasive species establish, it requires a lot of energy to push it out of that hill and push the community to a different stable state that isn't invasive species dominated, right? And we say that part of that difficulty is that management has their hands tied. There's a lot of things and tools that they don't have available to them that is available in natural areas. And one of those is prescribed burning. which we say is basically impossible in cities. And this paper was written in October last year, and then 1 month later, New York City burned, right? So in November, we had 14 acres of wildfire in Brooklyn and Manhattan, New York. And to a lot of residents, this was devastating. But to me, this is a very exciting research opportunity because it is a novel disturbance in our cities and is a new tool that I was previously arguing is basically unavailable. So I think it's really interesting to understand how the communities are going to respond to this, especially our native versus invasive, right? So we took a look at Prospect Park down here in Brooklyn and Inwood Hill Park all the way up here in Harlem, Manhattan. And we have in both of these parks our small little burned and then unburned areas. And we're looking at the plant and pollinator communities in these sites. Here you can see in Inwood, we're doing 2 sites to look at one at the top of the hill, one on the side of the hill. And what's really exciting to see just from this year of data, we've just been collecting data up till last week, is a huge shift in proportion of the community that is native versus invasive. In our unburned areas, we're averaging around 0 to 10% native percent. And in our burned areas, we're seeing a huge influx of native species. Around 90 to 100% native plants are dominated in these burned areas. And in these unburned areas, it's just English ivy and poison ivy, unfortunately, as well. And what's really valuable is this push to native. But also, once again, we're opening up a new community composition. So here in red, we have burned, blue is unburned. And you can see we're opening up a new community composition, a native-dominated community, introducing heterogeneity into our system with this novel form of disturbance. And so now I'm making the very difficult push of arguing that we should be burning in New York City. We'll see what FDNY has to say about that, but I think it is a valuable management tool. And again, I just want to reinstate that I agree that it is crucial that we manage these invasive species. They absolutely can be a problem in our cities. And then the last one is modern urban planning, right? Getting back to this repeating form of landscape architecture or urban planning or design. If we're doing this in terms of our buildings, we absolutely may be doing this in terms of our plant communities as well, right? And this is a risk for biodiversity, but it's also a risk for human-nature interactions. So there was a really cool study where they looked at homogenization of urban form and landscape architecture. And they found that more homogenization tend to lower people's effective bounds to places and decrease their intention to engage with their neighborhood. This is, of course, very well exemplified in the SpongeBob SquarePants episode, Squidville, where Squidward moves to Squidville because it's very cultivated and manicured, and it's exactly what he thinks he wants, right? But as you can see, this is a homogeneous landscape, and he grows to hate it. It's the same thing over and over again. There's no novelty. There's no heterogeneity. And so if we don't have this heterogeneity in our ecosystems, I think that we will lower people's effective bounds and enjoyment or usage of our green spaces. So I think it's really important that we think about introducing spontaneity, right? If we think about those Berlin and Munich data, we know that these cultivated ecosystems are nowhere near as heterogeneous as our spontaneous ones, right? Or if we think about Kevin Vega's research in Zurich, where he found that these flower pots can be really, really valuable for introducing heterogeneity into our cities, I think it's important that we value these, right? So in the future, we're going to be doing some work focused on maybe a little bit of guerrilla gardening, where we're trying to blend the cultivated and the wild and introduce wild species into our cities that are not invasive and introducing more native heterogeneity to support both biodiversity and human-nature interactions. So coming back to our pendulum, right? I've been arguing all the way over here this whole time. And I think that moving forward, it's very important that we push this pendulum back to this side, both in terms of how we think about our systems, but also the way that we actually manage them, and very purposefully trying to introduce heterogeneity and ensuring that wherever we find it, we support it, right? And the argument for understanding and valuing the heterogeneity in our cities is very important because if we come all the way back to the beginning, urban ecology is highly interdisciplinary. We work with so many other fields and so many young people, and it's really important that we instill with them the value of heterogeneity in our cities. And we don't just assume that they are all homogenous, because if government bodies, funders, and city planners assume that our cities are homogenous, then these green spaces will not be valued. And they are extremely valuable, and I would argue are extremely heterogeneous, and therefore should be studied as such, right? And so Monica and I are putting all of this into a paper that's currently in peer review. We have this really nice section on different research questions that we can use going forward to kind of get at this question a bit better or in new ways. And I wish I had time to talk about it today, but I could not fit it into the presentation. But I would, of course, be happy to talk about it afterwards if anyone has any questions. And with that, I would just say huge, huge thanks to, of course, Monica, who's been a big part of this work, but also her lab and other people who funded this, and you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That was awesome, Aaron. Thank you so much. Feels like a big distinction here could be talking about urbanization as a phenom, like as a noun, urban areas, versus as a verb.
Yeah, as a process.
Of urbanizing, of the act of cultivating. Because I could see the latter category being what is reducing biodiversity, right? You showed with your plants, when we're bringing in and we're planting, everybody is putting hostas in their gardens, right? Or whatever. So the act of urbanization, it could even be extended to your agricultural system, right? It's the act of cultivating is what is reducing today.
Yeah, I think that the question there was about basically, is urbanization a noun or a verb, and how they can have very different consequences. And I totally agree. I think it's super important. And again, the conversion matters a lot. Are we converting a remnant forest, or are we converting a cornfield into a suburban area, right? And so those are very important. And then the way that we do it is very important as well. And so I think that's why fields like landscape architecture can be really, really important, because we need to teach them that if you're part of a new development, it better not be red maple, red maple, red maple, red maple, right? It needs to have this heterogeneity, and they need to understand that from a human perspective and a biodiversity perspective as well. So, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I think is super interesting, and I certainly come at the research from a more community perspective, but I think that this like source sink stuff could be really interesting from a population perspective, and seeing where the population, the genetic diversity is of our large parks versus our satellite parks, to try and get an idea of separation between them and if size matters a lot there. So I think that it's a really interesting area of research that we can begin to develop. I'd love to talk about how to do that at the community level, maybe thinking about like functional groups or types of species. But yeah, I've only been thinking about that at a population level, but you're absolutely right. The community level could be really interesting as well. Yeah, Jay. What's that? Just repeat the question. Oh yeah, sorry. That was about source sink dynamics and metacommunities. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Super cool to see. I'm curious. I'm excited about your typologies of urban systems, and I'm sure the answer is like there's a lot of things that matter, but I'm curious if you have kind of certain characteristics that you think are going to be major tells in creating these typologies. And is it historical? Is it environmental? Is it socio? Like, what do you think is going to be the biggest drivers there?
Yeah. So the question was about the urban typologies and what characteristics we think may be playing dominant roles. And I think that one of the most important ones is going to be age. So age of the city is going to have a really big influence, because it influences, therefore, then how it was designed and how old some of our trees are, for example, in the cities, right? So I think that that is a hugely important one. I think that density is likely to be very important, and I don't know how to put it into a quantitative variable, but something about culture is going to be extremely important. And I don't have as much cultural research experience, so I need to bring in collaborators on that, but like I said, between Berlin and Munich, there's total cultural differences, and I think that that is a hugely important aspect of these typologies. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking within any ecosystem type or across ecosystems of a given type, there's always some degree of heterogeneity, but also some degree of homogeneity, and that tension between the two is really important because the homogeneity allows us to think about when patterns and processes converge and kind of allows us to uncover generality in patterns and processes.
Mm.
So I'm just wondering, in like translating that idea into the urban ecosystem realm, if you were to look across all urban ecosystems, do you think you see kind of the same balance between heterogeneity and homogeneity as you would in like all lakes around the world, or do you think they're more heterogeneous on average?
Yeah. So the question is, in all systems, in natural ecosystems, we have some degree of heterogeneity, some degree of homogeneity. And the question is, in urban areas, do we expect to see more or less, or different types of cities, right? Yeah. And a couple of things I want to say is that one of my central arguments is that urban ecosystems as an ecosystem type are not more inherently more homogeneous than, say, lakes or something else, right? That's my central argument. The other argument I want to make is that certain typologies are more or less heterogeneous or homogeneous than others. This 21st century American growth, I am concerned, is very homogeneous as compared to an old growth city, right? So even within urban, we have these typologies that have different degrees of homogeneity versus heterogeneity. But overall, if we consider all urban ecosystems versus all temperate forests, I argue that it's equal. Yeah.
When you're thinking about the biodiversity and its function, we're often, I think, thinking about the redundancy of functional traits and groups as being what's important to maintain biodiversity, especially in cities, for resilience. Did you consider in the German case study perhaps how the functional biodiversity dimensions changed or were supported?
Yeah, so that was a question about the resilience of ecosystem function in our urban ecosystems and how that changes. And I will say we didn't in this study, but Monica in that same system has another paper where she looked at that spontaneous biodiversity in these gardens and tied that to fruit set in the gardens of tomatoes and peppers, and found that gardens with higher wildflower patches, higher spontaneous biodiversity, led to larger peppers and fruits, tomatoes. Basically with the idea that these areas with more natural space support natural enemies or pollinators that help the fruits grow larger. So if we think about one very tiny specific ecosystem function like food production in gardens, we absolutely see the value of our spontaneous communities. If we think about heterogeneity of ecosystem services across our cities, that is not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think it's super interesting. Certain cities having more or less ecosystem services certainly exists, or even within neighborhoods, right? Like red line neighborhoods having different ecosystem services than not. So there's certainly something there, and something that we should think about moving forward. Yeah. Yeah.
Really interesting work. Great to see the talk. I was curious how you think about scale when you're thinking about this within city problem, because it does seem, I think, pretty convincing data that if you aggregate all these different things within a city, you get a very diverse landscape.
Yeah.
But I think if you were an individual and you were just dropped in a spot, at many of those spots you might not land there, and not knowing how you got there, think it's particularly urban. So how do you, if you took your granularity of scale and you shrank that down or expanded that, have you explored how that would influence your conclusions if you measured how urban a spot is at a 1 meter square or 10 meter square or 1 kilometer square, instead of just being like the whole city is one thing?
Yeah. So the question was the granularity of scale and how that influences these results. So one thing just from my experience of working with urbanization gradients is we always calculate urbanization at like the 500 meter, 1 kilometer, 1.5, 10 kilometer, like, and they are oftentimes highly correlated. So those values at that kind of spatial grain that we operate at, that is biologically relevant, is often highly correlated. So I would expect to see high correlation among our results at those types of spatial scales. Now, if we're thinking about within patch versus across patch, I think that that is also really interesting. And I think that, again, I want to say, if you were dropped into 20 cities versus 20 temperate deciduous forests, how homogenous would it look between our two, right? Like if we're seeing beach over and over again, is that different than seeing tree pits over and over again? I'm not entirely sure. So, yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about well, thanks for the talk, first of all, it was excellent. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about your fire data. So switching away from the urban homogenization hypothesis a little bit, and I'm familiar with those sites, but probably not everyone is. And so maybe if you could just say a little bit more about the differences between the two sites. And also I'm curious, you noted the pattern of greater proportion of native species after the burn, and I saw that that was kind of shifting over time a little bit. And so just, yeah, if you have thoughts about that, if it's, I'll let you.
Yeah, so these are two really cool, very different parks, I will say. I'll just go back to the slides on that really quick. Prospect Park is basically Brooklyn's Central Park. It's a very nice, very heavily trafficked, very manicured park. They have teams there that manage it a lot. Inwood Hill is actually a remnant forest site, so a very cool in a different way, but very, very low traffic, somewhat different ecosystem, and the slope and the topology is very different as well. So in Prospect Park, it's relatively flat, and Inwood Hill is a hill, and so there's very different typology as well. Another weird thing I wanted to point out is that in this burn, it was really, really intense, and they actually used water from the Hudson River for this larger burn to put it out, and so that was very, very brackish, salty water, and we can see that at the sites. There's a lot of salty soil now as a result, so I think that there's going to be some interesting effects of that. In terms of the trend, we do see it's really, really strong in April. And while it's still really strong in August, there is maybe a little bit of a blending closer together. And I'm absolutely concerned about the future. I think that there needs to be some seeding and some restoration done in some of these areas to ensure that we don't just fall back into the slope of invasive species dominance, right? But one really cool thing I did want to say is that we look at the tree data, and these three communities are now quite different, or at least here's Prospect Park, and then over here are two burns in Inwood Hill Park. And we can see that the tree community composition is quite different of what survived in our burned areas now as a result. And we do have a very strange amount of cherry popping up in our sites, or at least surviving the fire. And I was just talking to Robert Loeb, who did some research in the 70s in Bronx fires as well. And he did almost the same thing as me, where he looked at burned and unburned 3 different fires in New York. And he found a lot of cherry, sassafras, and oak popping up. And that is exactly what we've been seeing as well, those same 3 species. So I think it's really interesting to see how these burns are, 50 years apart, but introducing still these different communities. And moving forward, we would now like to see what do Robert's 1970s fires look like, to see kind of looking into the future, what are our forests going to look like potentially. So I think there's a lot of really interesting research to be done thinking about the recovery, the restoration, the succession of these fires, certainly.
Thank you. Any final questions?
Yeah.
I have a quick question about your bees project. Do you know what's the mechanism behind the changes, like plasticity, or do you think there's some other adaptation to be?
Yeah, the question was about the bee communities globally, right? That synthesis one I talked about it towards the beginning. Yeah. So I think what's going on there is really a difference in the habitat type resources and size. So from what we see in the size data of our bees is that in green roofs and urban farms and community gardens, we tend to see larger species. And then in our parks and natural spaces, we see smaller species. And I think that is a difference between those central place foragers versus mobile generalists that was highlighted in that other synthesis paper I talked about, where in our very small habitat patches, like green roofs or community gardens, you need to be a big bee that can pollinate and travel between multiple different sites. So you have to be a large species. But in our natural spaces and parks, you can be a central place forager. You can live entirely in that green space and therefore live on just those resources. You need to be quite small. And so we're seeing that divergence between small parks, big species, big parks, small species, essentially. Does that make sense? Kind of? Cool,
All
thanks.
right. I think actually we'll end, but Erin will be in the lunchroom and available for more questions there. So please help me in thanking Erin. And